Hi, my name is Deb Kramer. I'm the founder and executive director of Keep Coyote Creek Beautiful, and I'll be your moderator tonight. I love nature and have been hiking and backpacking and just out in nature for decades. And for nearly the last 10 years, I've been lucky to build a community around Coyote Creek. In particular, through our BioBlitz events, I've met some truly amazing people. And tonight, you're going to meet two of them. Today, we'll be talking about migrations and, in particular, birds. I'll start with a bit about Coyote Creek and why it is part of this wonderful ecosystem for birds. Marav will talk about community science tools that document bird migration. And our feature presenter is Carolyn, who shares about our wonderful migrating birds. We'll have time for question and answers at the end. So Coyote Creek is a 64-mile long river, and it starts in Henrico State Park. And it winds through Coyote Valley, downtown San Jose, Milpitas, and into San Francisco Bay. It's got a huge diversity of wildlife and ecosystems. Keep Coyote Creek Beautiful was founded in 2015, and we care for and advocate for Coyote Creek. We also educate people about the value of a healthy creek, and we also offer recreational activities to connect with the watershed. And I like to say it's all connected. So we engage, encourage, and educate people through the creek. We provide a voice for the creek. We have cleanups, creek and trail cleanups. We also encourage people to participate in some of the fun activities we have, especially to get out and get some fresh air and meet new people. We also offer education like this training and ways for people to learn about our watershed. So here you can see some of the ways that we've been able to build community specifically around nature. The Coyote Creek watershed is, as I mentioned, 64 miles long, and you can see here that it starts down at Henrico Park, makes a backwards J through Anderson Lake and Visitor Center, through Coyote Valley along Highway 101, and out to the bay through Milpitas. And one of the things that we've been able to do is go beyond just being outdoors and take you into a training mode with our Naturalist training series that Marav and I started. And we've hosted 9 training sessions so far, and you can see some of the topics. You can find all of our trainings on our YouTube channel, which is at Keep Coyote Creek Beautiful on YouTube. So I'm going to introduce Marav now. Marav Von Schack founded the BioBlitz Club, which is a community science organization. And its purpose is really to encourage people to get outside and learn about nature. Through this group's actions over the nearly past 8 years, she's hosted 100 events. But really, over 2,000 people have participated and contributed to the growing body of knowledge about nature through iNaturalist.
Thank you, Deb. Yeah, so my part is going to be very short because I want to leave a lot of time for Colin. So I'd just like to speak briefly about the tools we use to document birds. So if you join one of our events, either a webinar or in-person BioBlitz events or walks, then our main tool is iNaturalist, which is this incredible tool that we use to document any living thing, including birds. It actually has over 3,500 species of birds in North America alone, which is amazing. So iNaturalist is collecting occurrence data. Basically, you document something that you see. So you document that it's there. You don't document something that, you don't document saying that something is not there, which is actually also important for specific studies. You include either photos or sound recordings or both in each observation. And these observations can also include behavioral or ecological data in specific ways. I'll mention that in a second. And anyone can join in. It's free. It's very easy to use. You could document things from wherever you are. The way you could get behavioral or ecological data from observations is you could categorize them in different ways, such as including them in projects. And there are wonderful projects, some specifically for birds, like bird food, which is one I really like. There are some about bird migration. There are some that are more conservation oriented, and those could be used for advocacy or for different studies. And then on iNaturalist, you could also document birds, tracks, and signs. You could document feathers that you find. The app will actually try and identify it automatically for you, which is pretty cool. And real experts will look at your observations, hopefully, and suggest an ID as well as just a computer vision. And then you could document bird tracks and other signs, which is also really cool. eBird, on the other hand, is a slightly different tool. It also looks at occurrence, but at abundance as well. So you don't only note that you saw a bird, but also how many individuals of that same bird you saw during your little walk. It works on bird lists. Okay, so you create a list for everything you saw. And you can include photos, but you don't have to. Okay, so it could just be a list of what you saw at a specific point or a specific route. It's been on for a bit longer. So this model shows us the migration of barn swallows, and it's just amazing, I think. It's the incredible data that you get when you have millions of people that collaborate together. Okay, so many people submit their bird lists from wherever they are. In addition to some computer models can create very accurate maps that can predict where birds would go and help with conservation and with other efforts. I think it's just amazing. And both these platforms, by the way, are used for different studies, are really helpful. So if you are interested in becoming a community scientist, then this is a way that you can contribute real data. Okay, so people could use that later on.
So I'd like to introduce Carolyn Knight. She works for the Santa Clara Valley Bird Alliance as the education and outreach specialist, where she uses her degree in wildlife biology to share her enthusiasm for nature with the community through walks, talks, bioblitzes, and education.
Yeah, thanks so much, Deb. And thank you all of you for coming out tonight. I'm always super excited to speak with the folks from KCCB. You guys have an amazing community of naturalists, and I have so much fun taking part in bioblitzes with all of you. So a quick word about my organization. I'm part of the Santa Clara Valley Bird Alliance. We serve Santa Clara County with environmental education programs for local schools. We provide typically at least 200 public events with a lot of bird walks and other birding experiences with the community. And then we're also really engaged with environmental advocacy within Santa Clara County. So we've been involved with the protection of open spaces like the Coyote Valley that we got to explore with KCCB. This past weekend, we have worked with multiple cities around the Bay to design bird-safe design building rules, as well as dark sky initiatives to reduce light pollution. And we're constantly keeping an eye out for ways that we can better protect our local birds and the habitats that they rely on. So I'd just love to invite all of you out to join us on a field trip, enjoy the birds with us. We're really friendly and we try to be a very approachable group. So if you are even vaguely bird curious, I would really encourage you to come on out and get to exploring with us. So tonight we're talking about migrating birds. This is a really interesting topic for us to discuss in Santa Clara County in particular, because we are right smack dab in the middle of something called the Pacific Flyway, which basically for us means that as our seasons change, we see an incredible turnover in what species are calling Santa Clara County home for at least a couple of months. And a lot of that has to do with not just our location on the California coast, but also our proximity to large wetlands, like those found around the San Francisco Bay Area. The San Francisco Bay itself acts as a migratory hotspot. It's kind of that safe harbor for many of our aquatic birds that are embarking on migrations. And we're a nice pit stop for a lot of birds. It's part of their longer migration. So sometimes we get birds visiting Santa Clara County, and they only stick around for a couple of days. That does still mean they make it onto our county checklist, but they're not spending long term with us. All right. So just to start us off, I wanted to give us a definition of migration to work with. It's going to be the regular movement of animals from one region to another. Migration is found across the animal kingdom. You can find it in phytoplankton, migrating up and down their little water column throughout the day as the sun rises and sets. We see it in butterflies, most well known, the monarch butterfly, which is a multi-generational transcontinental migration. We see it in mammals crossing the Serengeti. So it's all over the animal kingdom. And of course, the scale of that is really going to depend on what sort of organisms we're talking about. But today, we're focused on the birds, our feathered friends. So those scales are going to be a little bit more manageable for us to wrap our heads around. So this is the flyway system I mentioned earlier. North America is split into 4 different flyways. We're smack dab in the middle of the Pacific Flyway. We decided to be real straightforward when it came to labeling these guys. So they're pretty easy to understand. It's important to know that while these flyways they look like they're very set in stone. We're talking about animals that can fly. And they, like every other type of wildlife, have really poor literacy rates. They don't read the field guides. We write about them. They don't care about the studies that we are doing on them. They're going to go wherever they please, or wherever the wind blows them. So we can use this as kind of more like a guideline for migration. Most of the time, when we're thinking of migration, some of the first animals that pop into mind are going to be things like geese. And we know in our heads, without thinking about it too hard, they're going to fly north to south, right? And when we're imagining migration, a lot of times we think of it as a way to avoid harsh winter or harsh weather conditions. And that is a really big part of bird migration. Birds can avoid a lot of stress if they can just manage to be somewhere else when those snows come in. So it really is a way for them to avoid some of the harsher stressors that other animals would have to deal with. They're going to deal with the harsh weather in Canada by simply just not being in Canada during the winter, which fair enough. But migration can also be fueled by a need for food. A lot of our birds are actually following food sources with their migrations. And sometimes birds and other animals are even migrating in order to find a mate. So there's a couple of different factors that are going to come into play when we're talking about the motivations behind migration. Now, in our head, we've got the mold of migration being north to south. They're avoiding the weather. We do have some notable examples that are found here in Santa Clara County that kind of break that mold. One of my favorite examples is the long-billed curlew. You can find these guys out in Don Edwards and the Palo Alto Baylands, basically all around the San Francisco Bay right now in those wetlands. This is a really gorgeous shorebird. It's quite large. It's got this lovely cinnamon color that you can see underneath the wings. But they've got this absolutely ridiculous beak that's about 8 inches long or so that they're going to use to pull worms and crustaceans out of the mud. And these birds, instead of doing the whole north-south deal, they actually will breed in the Great Plains. We can see their range map to the side here. So their breeding habitat is marked out in orange, and then the blue is where they're going to be spending the winter time. So they're breeding in inland, where there's going to be a lot of ponds, a lot of freshwater wetlands that are relatively protected. But as the weather gets colder, as those areas start experiencing freezing temperatures, they're moving out towards the coast where the temperature is going to be a little bit more reliable. And then they've got that easily accessible food because they're not worried about the ground freezing. Um, Another example of migratory birds that are kind of doing their own thing is the pine siskin. And this little guy here is often mistaken for house finches. They look quite similar. They're going to be visiting the same feeders if you do have them in their yard. And these fellows, while their range map makes a lot more sense in a classical sense, we've got them breeding up north, and then they're coming down south for the winter time. I'm also going to point out that the purple is where they're here year round. All of these range maps that we're using today are going to use the same color coding scheme. So purple's where they are year round, that orange is going to be breeding, and then blue is winter. Um, but these guys are irregular migrants. And what they're doing is they're not so much flying large distances, but oftentimes their migration, which is fueled by the need for food, is just an elevation change. They're coming down from the mountains, from the hills into the valleys during the harsher winters where there aren't as many food resources available where they typically live. Now, with the pine siskins, the reason that might sound like a familiar species to you is they are unfortunately natural carriers for salmonella. So the last time we had an eruptive year with pine siskins, we did unfortunately have to advise a lot of people to take their feeders down just for avian safety. But this is a really great example of a species that's being driven to migration simply because of the lack of food in their normal habitats. So it's not always going to be just because the birds don't want to deal with snow or ice. So let's talk a little bit about how birds actually make migration happen, because there's some astounding feats of just pushing physiology to its limits. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that birds are just built different. They have a hollow skeletal system that is actually connected to their respiratory system. Their uh, all of their skeleton is basically squished in together, so the majority of their mass is going to be in a very centralized location. And this holds true for all birds, even the ones that don't fly, because the ancestral bird, the proto-bird, was capable of flight. All of those species, the ostriches, the kiwis, the rays that cannot fly, they've actually lost the ability to fly. So they had it originally, and then they arrived in habitats where, you didn't really have to fly. And so they were able to basically adapt to different challenges. So this little white-crowned sparrow is one of my favorite birds to point out when we're talking migration, because these guys are the workhorses of North American migration studies. They have been, connected to all sorts of little monitors. We have put them on little treadmills. We have locked them in labs and played with their light conditions. So we've done all manner of little things to these little guys. And they're really widely spread. So right now in Santa Clara County, these little guys have arrived. They are in your gardens. They're in your local parks. They've got a really lovely kind of melancholy twinkle, twinkle little star song that they sing. And they're one of our first migratory birds to really start arriving. So they're kind of our signal that the winter migration has begun. So talking a little bit more about how birds are just built differently. The respiratory system for birds is incredibly complicated, and I could probably spend about a week going through it with you all. We're not going to do that because you're not in an ornithology class. But the main thing to know is birds have an incredibly efficient respiratory system. They've actually got a unicycler flow. So instead of the mammalian operation where we're inhaling and then we're exhaling, and those are two separate operations. Birds are able to kind of constantly inhale and then exhale at the same time. And the way this happens is they've actually got air sacs that act as bellows, forcing air through their lungs. And the lungs themselves aren't physically expanding and contracting like ours are. The lungs are a set size. It's a very large portion of the bird's internal organs. And those air sacs are also coming into play when we're looking at a bird's buoyancy as well. And it's part of that respiratory system that does get connected to their skeletal system. In addition to that, birds have this incredibly efficient circulatory system. Just like us humans, they do have a four-chambered heart, but theirs evolved separately from our own. So it is built a little bit differently. And it is basically designed to really maximize the oxygenation of their blood. And in fact, some of our migratory birds actually have an extra type of hemoglobin to really just maximize how much oxygen they're able to get. And this is really important when you're doing things like flying over Mount Everest or flying for 8 days straight over the Pacific Ocean, because you can't land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You're going to be eaten by something, but you do have to figure out how to get from Alaska to New Zealand, right? So this is a big part of how birds manage to accomplish what they do. Another really important thing to keep in mind with birds is they need to have the energy to fuel all of this activity, right? And the way they do that is with fat. Your average migratory bird can add anywhere from 1 to 3%, but there have been studies that have found individuals that can gain up to 10% of their body weight in fat stores in a single day. Your average migratory bird is going to be gaining 10 to 30% of their body weight. But for some of the little songbirds, like the little warblers that are visiting us now, little tiny yellow birds that are hopping up in the tops of the trees eating insects right now, some of them are actually doubling their body weight. And this kind of confusing picture is actually what it looks like when you blow on the stomach of a bird, which is what we do when we've captured them for bird banding. Which is a way that scientists do a lot of our migratory bird studies. Essentially, you set up something called mist nets. The birds fly into them, and then you can essentially extract them from the nets. You can attach tracking bracelets on them, or sometimes even little tracking backpacks with GPS signals, depending on what sort of study you're running. But we do a lot of checking of these fat levels because it tells us a lot about the health of a bird. And that fat is just under the skin of a bird, which is super, super thin and translucent. And so the yellow that you're seeing under this bird's feathers is actually its layer of fat padding over its flight muscles. So fat is the most efficient way for them to get that energy back into their systems. It's the most weight effective. And so it goes into a lot of what dictates whether or not a migration is going to be successful for a bird, because they're going to burn through that fat very, very quickly, particularly if they are flying without stop, which many of them will do. In addition to actually fueling that flight, we do have to talk a little bit about navigation. Many of our birds are going to use a mix of these tools. If our migratory birds are flying during the daytime, we do see them use a lot of landmarks. Oftentimes they will follow rivers or waterways. But we also have actually found out that some of our seabirds, like the sooty shearwater, which occasionally comes into the San Francisco Bay Area, but is your best bet for finding them is to honestly just hit the Santa Cruz Pier and you'll see them out in the ocean. Sometimes they'll actually use smell to help them navigate, which makes a great deal of sense because one, these are birds with a great sense of smell, and two, there's not a lot of landmarks in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right? So they're using what's available to them. We have found that birds will also navigate using the celestial bodies, using the sun, using the stars to orient themselves. And a really cool thing that we discovered this year is the magnetic fields that we've always kind of hypothesized that birds are able to sense. It turns out they can see them. And so there's a special protein in migratory bird eyes called Cry4 protein. But it actually allows them to see the magnetic fields of the Earth. And apparently, it's supposed to look something like the Northern Lights, these bands of blue, which can help them navigate. And this is particularly important because landmarks can change. If you have a species, for example, like the whooping cranes, um, who famously had to be taken into captivity and bred. It's a giant migratory bird. We had to reteach them their migratory route. But having something like a magnetic field that these birds can navigate by is really something that's kind of mind-boggling for us because that's not a sense we have. It's kind of like trying to describe color to someone who just can't see. We're trying to figure out how they're navigating with something that we just don't have access to. And on the topic of incredible migratory birds, that sooty shearwater, it's migrating about 40,000 miles a year. They're going to breed on tiny little islands in the Pacific. Sorry, Australia, you're still counting as an island. But then they're basically drawing figure eights around the world's oceans, following schools of fish. And then they do have to make their way back to those islands that they were born on if they want to breed and reproduce in the next year. And before we jump in, there is another way that we track birds that I wanted to share with you all. This is a pretty cool piece of tech. This is Birdcast, which I promptly shared and then stopped sharing. So this is Birdcast, and what we're looking at is the 1st of November. And what we're watching happen here, it looks like we're watching a storm move from the north to the south on the East Coast. What we're actually seeing is giant flocks of birds. And they are flying in such density that they're actually picked up by weather radar. So one of the really cool tools that has become accessible to us is this weather radar data, where you can get live reports of the birds that are flying over your homes at night. And one of the neat things that we do with this information is we actually are able to get connected with large cities and areas with a lot of light pollution and with some we're gonna call it waxing rhapsodical about the birds. We can actually sometimes get these larger cities to actually reduce their light pollution during nights of really heavy migration, which can reduce the chances of things like window collisions. It can help the migratory birds because the light that shoots up into the air can actually disorient them. That's something that, unfortunately, the best example of it is actually the World Trade Center's memorial lights. Those go up and are lit on September 11th, obviously. But those lights actually have to have volunteers to sit at the base of them so that when too many birds have gotten trapped in the lights, the volunteers can turn the lights off. The birds can disperse again, get back onto their um, get back onto their migration, and then they can turn the lights back on for the memorial. So that is something we like to kind of include as part of community science, but also advocacy.
Carolyn, I
So
have a question for you. You were talking about testing birds, and one of the
yeah,
things that caught my ear was treadmills. So
yes.
how do you test a bird on a treadmill?
You don't give them very much room uh, to take flight. Um, Yeah, so it was a small treadmill. The birds weren't given enough space to really take flight, so they're in a very narrow little tunnel. And the treadmill is going at a very slow rate. But it's a really it's a fun little bit of imagery to have in your head. And something that I love to talk about with prospective biology students or people who are looking to get into science. If you want to do really strange science, um, wildlife studies is kind of where it's at. There's a lot of behaviors that we're still exploring. There's a lot of things that we can still learn about even the most common birds. Um, I believe they just found a promising drug to treat like Alzheimer's from a frog or something like that. So biological studies, even if it does seem like it's kind of silly to just hook a bird up to a treadmill, there's a lot that we can learn about our own biological systems and find things that we would consider to be of value outside of just this animal is valuable because it exists, you know? Let's talk a little bit about some of the birds that we get here in Santa Clara County. So there's two main migrations that happen here and affect us in this county. So the winter migration is the one we're in right now. This is a migration that starts in the fall. We typically still see birds arriving as part of that migration into the start of December. But a lot of these birds are going to be spending the entire winter with us, sticking around into about early March or so before they disperse again to their breeding grounds. Um, and there's a couple of different groups of birds that really kind of typify who's visiting at this time of the year. Um, these are the waterfowl, so things like our ducks and our geese, our shorebirds. So these are birds that are going to be hanging out at the beach in our wetlands. These are things like sandpipers or that long-billed curlew. They're kind of typified by eating invertebrates. They're going to have variable lengths of beaks and legs, but they're all kind of using that same sort of wetland habitat that's really productive year-round in terms of food sources. We see a lot of our songbirds, but these most of the songbirds that we see visiting us in the wintertime are birds that are going to be feeding on more of our berries, our seeds. Like we get cedar waxwings. We're getting a lot of our sparrows. Our warblers are going to be going after the insects. And then our most dramatic migration, the migration that gets people super, super excited, and is the reason that Hawk Hill and the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory is even a thing, are the raptors. A lot of Canada's hawks and falcons actually fly through the Bay Area. And if you're a super motivated birder who really loves getting up at some terrible hours and standing on top of a windy, foggy hill and staring into the sky, you can join Hawkwatch. Um, but I do want to highlight some of the visitors that we have, and we're going to talk about where you can actually find these birds. So the first one I want to share with you is the greater white-fronted goose. Sometimes these guys are called specks because of the speckling on their bellies. These are not the Canada geese that you have childhood trauma from. These are some really lovely birds that spend most of their time up in the Canadian tundra. You're going to want to look for these in the agricultural fields and the wetlands. So places like Coyote Valley and Don Edwards are great locations to look for these birds. Just like the Canada geese, they love grass, right? So if there's a lot of young vegetation, that's where they're going to be gathering because they love those tender little leaves. These are birds that migrate in flocks, which is important, not just from protection for predators, but it actually reduces the amount of energy that they have to use while they're migrating. When we think of geese, we typically think of them as flying in that kind of classic V formation, right? And while the bird at the point is experiencing all of the turbulence and rough air possible, all of the birds flying behind it in formation are having a much easier time. And it turns out that birds aren't just, the geese rather, aren't just picking one poor sucker who's got to deal with it all day. They do actually switch that role. But it's typically the older and more experienced geese because that point goose is deciding where they're going to go. And when you're traveling several hundred miles, you don't want necessarily the goose that has never made this flight before to be leading you. And I do want to play a little bit of audio here. So apologies if it blasts out your speakers. But this is the sound of a flock of snow geese. And it's like a cacophony. Oh, no. I was just audience to a really lovely sound of squawking geese. You all know what that sounds like. One of the reasons that this is a sound I associate with migration, though, is in the Central Valley of California, where we've got all of those agricultural fields and all of those rice fields that get flooded during the winter time. That's where we see our waterfowl gathering in the thousands and tens of thousands. So I'd like you to imagine the last time you ran onto a grass field and you scared up a bunch of Canada geese, multiply that by 100, and that's about the sound of one of these flocks. So there's nothing tiny about this. There's nothing delicate. It's one of those sounds that you really feel in your chest. And this is the migration itself. So the yellow is marking out their migration pattern. We've got their breeding way up in Alaska and the Canadian tundra up into the Arctic Circle. And then they're going to come down south into Texas, into California, into the Pacific Northwest. And while they're doing this, they've got to gain about 30% of their body weight. And we're not talking tiny little songbirds that you could fit in your pocket. We're talking about a goose. So that is a lot of weight. That is a lot of bugs. That's a lot of vegetation that has to be consumed before they are ready to go. Because the risk of running out of fat reserves during your migration, well, if that happens, you don't reach your end point, right? You're not going to make it to those wintering grounds. And a goose on its own is not a happy or a safe goose. Another one of our really fun waterfowl that we get, this is what I like to fondly refer to as weird duck season. This is the hooded merganser, and they are very much part of that weird duck category. And we call them weird ducks because these are not the ducks that you typically see in your neighborhood pond, right? It does not have a green head. It does not have a happy little yellow beak. And that's because these ducks are actually hunting fish. So they're quite a bit more predatory than the mallards that we typically think of when we say the word duck. And these guys are either going to be resident birds or medium distant migrants. So it really depends on what sort of habitat that they are breeding in. But you want to look for these guys in our creeks and our rivers. Sometimes you'll spot them on the ponds and the reservoirs, but these are birds that really like a wooded covered area. They like those creekside forests to hide in. And this is what their migration looks like. So the hooded mergansers that are breeding west of the Rocky Mountains will go south down into the Pacific Northwest and into California. An odd thing is that the birds that will actually nest in the Midwest, sometimes they will actually fly north during their winter migration because they're trying to get to the Great Lakes. The lake effect makes it so while there is quite a bit of snow in those areas, the overall temperature is a little bit warmer. These are birds that arrive kind of late. Um, and then they're going to leave pretty early in the springtime because these are birds that have a super competitive nesting requirement. They're actually looking for holes that they find in trees to build their nests. So any hooded merganser that lags behind has a very decent chance of not finding the proper habitat it needs in order to safely nest and raise chicks. Our least sandpiper is another really fun migrant bird. For this one, there's a really handy, literally, size comparison. So this little guy is only about 5 to 6 inches. So that's a little bit less than the length of an adult's hand, depending on if you're male or female. But this is the smallest shorebird in the world. They are super, super tiny. They only weigh about an ounce. But if you go out to the Palo Alto Baylands, to Don Edwards, really anywhere around the San Francisco Bay or onto the coast right now, you're going to spot these little guys. And if you're looking closely and you've got your binoculars, you can actually tell which birds are on their very first migration because the juvenile least sandpipers, the ones that were born this spring, that are on their first journey, they've got these really brightly colored stripes of red that go across their backs. And you can see a little bit of that here in this picture. Right on the bird's shoulder, you've got kind of this reddish orange feather coloration. These guys are really long distance migrants. So this is their migration map. You'll notice that it's spanning 2 continents. For the West Coast ones, most of their flight is done over land, so they are able to navigate using landmarks. They're also able to take breaks. So they are going to keep an eye out for wetlands as they fly, where they can stop and rest and hopefully regain some of their fat reserves before continuing on their migration. But the eastern populations have to fly over the Atlantic, and that's anywhere from 1,800 to 2,500 miles. And as you can imagine, when you are a teensy tiny little bird, you don't want to stop. Every so often online, you'll see these videos of sailors on the giant shipping container, like freight ships, and they're with these little tiny songbirds or sandpipers that have basically just landed on the ship. And these are our migrants that have kind of just reached the ends of their energy reserves, and they spotted this absolutely gargantuan ship, and they decided, well, at the very least, I can get some sleep on here. And so we do sometimes see them hitching a ride on ships. It's it's part of those really funny experiences you get studying animals. Sometimes birds that we're tracking on their migrations with real-time GPS signals. Sometimes you can actually see when they hop on a boat because the line they take is suddenly slightly different from the rest of the birds, and they're just happily riding that ship to wherever it takes them before they take flight again. So even though these are animals that are capable of incredible feats, if they can see an easier way to do something, they're going to. And we really can't blame them for that. Another really adorable bird that we get here in our winter um, migration is this little ruby-crowned kinglet. And this, to be fair, is a very irritated ruby-crowned kinglet. This little guy is about the size of a bush tit, super, super tiny. If you could fit it into an envelope, you'd only need one stamp to mail it. These little guys are really short distance migrants. It's usually, just like the pine siskin, elevation based, but they are way more regular about it than the pine siskins. So there's never a year where we're just like, oh, I guess we're not getting ruby-crowned kinglets this year. They have arrived. We actually saw them on our BioBlitz this past weekend, but they're named for this cute little crest that they raise when they're feeling aggressive or territorial. Another good way to keep an eye out for them is those wing bars, those bars of white on the bird's wings up in the coverts, those feathers near the bird's kind of wrist and shoulder. And there's a lot of yellow edging on this bird, whether it's in its tail or wing feathers, or if you're lucky enough to see one in hand, the little palm pads of their toes are actually bright yellow, which is my favorite useless identifying mark. Absolutely useless in the field, super handy if you're trying to band these little guys. Another really fun one. This is the ferruginous hawk. This is an absolutely spectacular raptor. And it's actually the hawk that's on our opening slide. So this is a really massive, what's called a buteo, a broad-winged hawk. They are really pale on the underside. These are actually one of the few hawks that have feathers all the way up to their toes. With many of our hawks and eagles, they've actually got scales to better protect their legs. But these guys have those fluffy legs, still, ending with some pretty impressive and terrifying talons. But these birds actually come in during the winter from the more of the Midwest Great Plains area, and they're going to be coming into our agricultural fields. So the Coyote Valley is really the place to find them. Kind of middling in size between a red-tailed hawk and an eagle. So they're very large. That pale underside does make them pretty easy to spot. And then they've got this flaming orange back that just makes them super spectacular to see as they're kind of gliding through the air. They're one of my favorite wintering birds that we get here, and they're very reliable in the Coyote Valley. Spreckles Hill that we visited on last weekend's BioBlitz is one of the most reliable spots to find them if you're looking to add ferruginous hawk to your bird list this year.
So you mentioned that one of the birds migrates and it needs to get there early for the holes in the trees to nest.
Yeah, the hooded
Who
merganser.
are they? Yeah, who are they displacing?
So a lot of these holes actually form naturally in the trees. They tend to be created when a tree loses a branch and then part of the trunk rots out. Some woodpeckers will make holes large enough for them, and we're talking really large woodpeckers like the pileated woodpecker, which is about the size of a crow. But the issue with the hooded merganser is they are not the only duck that likes to nest in those cavities. And so a way that they've kind of gotten around it is they do have a habit of parasitizing nests. So if a female hooded merganser has an egg that's ready to lay and she does not have a nest of her own, she's just going to pop into whatever cavity that already has a nest in it, and she's going to lay her egg in there. And so that actually will result in these nests of mixed eggs and chicks, but it also can end up with like you've got one nest and it's got like 20 ducklings in it. And obviously, one female duck was not responsible for all of them, but those are her babies now, and she is gonna take care of them.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
pretty crazy. Hey, Ron posted a question. Why do Canada geese stop migrating and become residents? And Rob similarly asked, do we have a year-round population of ruby-crowned kinglets in the Bay Area?
Our local hills, and like the Santa Cruz Mountains are high enough elevation that we do have some residential kinglets, that will stick around year round, up towards the peaks. So like if you're hanging out around Skyline Boulevard, most of the kinglets that will get into the valley are going to be, migratory. Regarding the Canada geese, a lot of the Canada geese that we have here were actually introduced by hunters. So we did have like a natural population of Canada geese that were doing their regular migratory thing. And then hunters wanted to bring in more game, so they brought in some Canada geese. And then as kind of the culture shifted here in the Bay Area, there's fewer hunters. So that kind of removes the control for that Canada goose population. And then as the hunters kind of declined, we also saw the rise of things like golf courses, and soccer fields and schoolyards and all of that, which has basically created this year-round buffet for the geese with our really mild temperatures, and climate and all of the food that we keep putting out for them. Most of our Canada geese are no longer migratory. Um, so when you do have a large scale shift, in the habitat and in the resource availability of an area, that can actually have a really big impact on the migration, whether or not an animal is going to migrate, because a lot of it is driven by that food availability. If they're migrating because the food that they rely on gets buried under, 6 feet of snow, if they're in an area where snow doesn't happen, they don't really see a need to put themselves through the stress of gaining like 30% more of their body weight and having some of their internal organs actually shrink in the process. The stress of flying a couple 100 miles and flying every night nonstop. Um, so yeah, it's really that we kind of, we made the problem with Canada geese, and we're dealing with uh, the results.
Well, thanks for sharing that.
With our summer migrants, we see fewer birds coming in, but these birds are coming in specifically to breed. So they're going to be singing, they're going to be super vocal, they're going to make it really obvious that they're here. Our bird diversity is actually higher in the winter, but the summer has a lot of fun things to find. And this is going to include things like our hummingbirds, our swallows, our flycatchers, our orioles. So one of these guys is a kind of a habitat generalist. This is the black-chinned hummingbird. So as you can see in this picture, it does have a little black chin, but it also has this bright purple throat. You're gonna find them everywhere you find other hummingbirds. So if you've got a lot of flowers in your yard, congratulations, you probably have black-chinned hummingbirds. These little guys are going to come up north for the wintertime, but because they are smaller than the Anna's hummingbirds, which are here with us year round, they don't quite have the body mass necessary to make it through our winters. Hummingbirds are little freaks of nature, and they'll do something called torpor, which is like this really short-term hibernation where their metabolic system basically kind of just shuts down. And then as the sun comes up and their body warms up a little bit, they're awake and aware again. Um, but for these little guys, they are migratory. So we get them here in the summer after they've had the opportunity to breed. And with hummingbirds, it's a very short little window. It really only takes them about a month. So they may have 1 or 2 clutches of eggs, a couple opportunities to actually raise chicks. Then they're going to be flying back down south into Mexico. But you can find these guys in any of the flower or rose gardens, if you've got a nice arboretum in your neighborhood or something like that, that's going to be your best bet for black-chinned hummingbirds. Or if you just have a ton of flowers in your garden. The barn swallow is actually one that we got to see its migration pathway. So this is a super long distance migrant. And these guys are coming specifically to build their nests in our wetlands. My favorite place to spot these guys is gotta be the Palo Alto Baylands. Not only is the birding just super accessible, the birds are right out there. You can actually walk right up to these birds' nests. And what they do is they actually build these nests out of mud that they gather from the marsh itself. And you can, if you get there in March or April, you can actually watch them build these nests beak by beakful by beakful of mud. So they're scooping that mud up in their beaks and then they're going to spit it out again to form these really solid and well protected mud daub nests. And I believe if you go out to the Palo Alto Baylands now, there's still a couple of nests from this previous breeding season. That are still intact enough to be recognizable. This is a bird that, because it's eating flying insects, wants to avoid rain and things like that. So if they were to stay with us through our winter, their foraging opportunities would be pretty limited because whenever it's raining out, the bugs are not flying, and then these guys don't have food. But during the summertime, when our wetlands are abuzz with gnats and flies and mosquitoes, they're going to be right in the middle of it. Western kingbirds, another one of our insectivores. These guys are part of the tyrant flycatchers. So as the name kind of implies, they're jerks to each other. Super aggressive birds, quite ferocious. So like this is an adult Western kingbird actually feeding a dragonfly it caught to one of its babies. You can find these guys in our grasslands where they're going to be hunting those flying insects. If you're looking to find where they nest, keep an eye out for cavities in trees. They really like to find those little holes to hide away in. But something I find really interesting about these guys is they actually have to split their migration. Their molts, the process in which they actually grow new feathers to replace old and damaged ones, actually happens in the middle of their migration. So they'll start their migration from California, and by the time they're getting to about the Arizona, New Mexico border, they actually have to stop, finish that molt out, and then they'll continue further south. So they do have to actually kind of work around their own biological schedule. The hooded oriole is probably our most colorful migrant. And I really like this one in particular because this is a bird that not only is in our neighborhoods, if you've got palm trees, congratulations, you have hooded orioles in your neighborhood in the summertime. But we've actually seen this bird's range expand northward because of the popularity of palm trees in landscaping. So the human interest in having that kind of Hollywood aesthetic has actually created more habitat for these birds to take advantage of, which is pretty darn neat. Obviously, when we're talking about these kind of global, worldwide natural phenomenon, there's a ton that can go wrong. So one of those things that can go wrong is navigation. It's tough. You can see the magnetic fields of the Earth, but if your sense of direction is just kind of bad, you can get lost like this oriental turtle dove did a couple years ago. It ended up in Palo Alto. You can see on its range map that it should have been somewhere in China, probably. So what it did was it made a wrong turn somewhere around Siberia, ended up following the wrong coast of the Pacific Ocean until it found a habitat with a climate it thought was suitable, and it spent the entire winter in Palo Alto, attracting hundreds, if not thousands, of birders to this one random neighborhood in Palo Alto. All wanting to see this bird that had somehow made it across the ocean. We also have the unfortunate reality of our world. Sometimes habitat disappears. When you are a migratory bird, you're heavily dependent on habitat that you're not in year round. So if something happens to that habitat, you're not going to get a notification on your phone that says, oh, the hotel we stayed at is no longer in operation. They just get there and they don't find the resources they need. So birds like the Wilson snipe, which depends on our wetlands, can be really vulnerable to things like development or habitat degradation. And there's a lot of groups that work to mitigate that and to stop that. But it's a very real reality for a lot of our migratory birds, particularly those that are reliant on our wetland habitats. The United States has lost a crazy amount of wetland habitat in the past few centuries. California's lost like 80 to 90% of our wetlands. And that's one of the factors that not only makes migration risky, but it also means things like avian flu or botulism, means those things can flare up more because we have this very tight space where all of these different birds are interacting. Um, so it kind of creates this kind of haven for zoonotic diseases, unfortunately. And then, timing is everything. This little Allen's hummingbird relies on a lot of the coastal fog to feed the plants that it relies on during its migration. And unfortunately, with climate change, what we're seeing start to happen is these birds are having to range further and further north on their migrations in order to get the habitat that has the fog that they need. And this feeds into the mismatch hypothesis that eventually, with climate change, we are going to have migratory species for whom timing is incredibly important, whether it's the timing of the plants that they rely on, or the insects, or the fish that might be in the waters they're visiting. All of these things have different generation cycles and so can adapt to changing climates at a different rate. And so the organisms with the longer generational cycle are going to take longer to make those changes. And so it's something that at this point, if we really do manage to get serious about climate change, we could potentially reverse. But it is something that we're kind of on the knife edge of. Um, so I do want to mention the Christmas bird count is happening right now. So the San Jose and the Palo Alto Circle are no longer recruiting because they are going out this weekend. But the Morgan Hill and Claro Count Circle, as well as the Mount Hamilton's Count Circle, they are going out a little bit later. So if you're interested in getting involved in a community science project that's been going on in the United States for, oh gosh, this is the 125th year. This is a really cool opportunity to do so. We go out, we count birds no matter what the weather's like. And it all goes into a publicly accessible database of all of that information. Questions? All right.
We have one, Carolyn. Do we know if non-migrating populations live longer?
Yeah. Um, it really, it kind of does depend on like what type of bird we're talking about. So things like raptors, as majestic as they are, tend to have really low lifespans, simply because it's a tough life to have to hunt and catch all of your meals. Um, I would say that the non-migrating populations are less vulnerable to a lot of the things like climate change, that do make migratory birds in particular particularly vulnerable. But when you lose that kind of migratory instinct, that does mean that you're a lot more dependent on the health of the habitat that you are in. So with migratory birds, at least they have the opportunity to scout out their ranges. And this is something that we see with some of our vagrant birds, the birds that pop up and you're just like, you're supposed to be in Florida right now, right? It's not all because they got knocked off course by a storm. Sometimes they really are scouting out for additional habitat to kind of move into. So it's a double-edged sword with migration. It does give the populations that opportunity to kind of explore and check out their options a little bit, you know, scout out the neighborhood. Um, but it is such a stressful it's such a stressful part of their life cycle, and it really does open them up to a lot of danger. So I it's kind of six of one, half a dozen of the other, which I'm sorry, it's not like a um, there's no 100% answer that I have at least. Um, you're kind of with as with all biological systems and any ecological talk, you're weighing the risks basically.
Here's
Uh,
another question, Carolyn. Is there a San Mateo County Bird Alliance? And there used to be the Sequoia Audubon.
yeah,
So what is it called now?
yeah. So they are still called Sequoia Audubon. They're a little bit of a smaller chapter, and they are volunteer run, but they are still active. So they do still do field trips, and they are also, I think they've got two circles that are participating in the Christmas bird count. So they do some lovely work up there.
Another question, does feeding birds disrupt their migration?
Yeah. Once again, I've got the very unhelpful answer that it depends on what species we're talking about. But it takes a lot to disrupt the migration instinct. Um, there's something called Zugenrow, which is a German term, because of course it is, for like the migratory instinct. And it turns out that there's a decent portion of that that's actually genetic. So migratory birds, particularly ones that have a fixed migration, that every year they're going on a migration. It's not like a pine siskin where they're just like, no, we have enough, you know, seeds available to us. We're not going to do that this year. Um, with those birds, if you do have a reliable source of food, um, and a lot of it, you can kind of throw that migration out of whack. But it has to be of a scale that's way beyond anyone's individual bird feeder, or you know, plantings in your yard is going to be able to provide. So you don't really have to worry about your like personal feeder. Keeping the white-crowned sparrows around too late in their migration. They're going to head out when they need to head out. But um, if you have like an entire city that suddenly opens up, you know, birdseed buffets, then I might be worried. And then that kind of brings us back into the Canada geese conundrum, where we essentially took an entire a geographic area and we're just like, we're going to make the best possible food source for all of these geese. We're not going to have any predators or any sort of hunting that's going to really keep their population in check. So of course they're not going to migrate, right? Why would they fly 500 miles if they don't have to? Yeah, and I actually see some of my volunteers on this. So nice to see y'all. One of the things I really love with these naturalist trainings is it really does give all of the different environmental volunteers an opportunity to kind of broaden their knowledge base. So many folks that are involved with either environmental education or just community science around here are kind of cross-pollinating, and I think it really strengthens the entire environmental community that we've got here. Um, and just that willingness to share knowledge.
But Ron had a question for you, Carolyn. Are there nocturnal birds like owls that migrate?
Yeah, there are. So It's a little bit less known about them, just because it's naturally harder to study them. Um, but we get short-eared owls in the marshes around the San Francisco Bay here. They're a migratory species. One of the cool things about them is so they're coming down in the wintertime. They share habitat with northern harriers, which can look pretty darn similar to an owl, especially in flight, because they've got that short, rounded head. So one of the cool things, it seems like every year there's at least one short-eared owl that's spotted out at like Bixby. Um, and you can watch it as the sun is setting. The harriers are doing one last pass over the grasses and the marshes, and then the short-eared owl comes out, and it's just a very slight difference in how they fly, um, and a little bit of that physical configuration. So if you're patient, you can spot the difference. There's also some small owls like the northern saw-whet, which is little tiny guy, like about the size of my coffee mug. Um, and for the longest time, we didn't think they migrated. It turns out they're just doing it at night, which shouldn't have been a shock to anyone. But sometimes you just need that confirmation. So one thing I do want to note is we're very much still learning about migration. This is this is something that the advances in technology, especially oddly enough, the advances in battery technology have actually assisted a lot with. So now we're able to do more of that real-time migration tracking, and not just in the macro scale like Birdcast does with the weather radar, but actually being able to attach a little tiny backpack with a battery, and a GPS transmitter, onto the back of even birds as small as like our little songbirds and warblers, the tiny little birds that can like sit in the palm of your hand. Um, and one of the technologies that we use that for is the Modis Tower. And San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory has actually installed a couple Modis towers, as has Point Blue, around the Bay Area. And whenever a bird with a transponder on its little backpack flies by one of those Modis towers, it pings it. And so you can basically go, oh, Alvin, or whatever string of numbers the bird is actually called, um, has just flown by as part of his migration. Um, so it's something that advances in tech are still kind of opening up this world to us. We actually hosted a talk, I believe it was last month, with one of the scientists that studies the bar-tailed godwit, which is we get a similar species here, which is the marbled godwit. But this is a shorebird that for the longest time we just kind of accepted that they just kind of magically appeared from Alaska to New Zealand. They're like, they show up somehow, right? It turns out they are in fact making that 8-day flight over the Pacific Ocean nonstop. So there's no stopping points. They're just powering through it. But that was really only possible with that real-time GPS tracking technology. Um, so yeah, a lot of fun things still to be discovered.
Well, interesting you mentioned about the 8-day travel because one of the questions I had was what percentage of those overwater migrating birds actually die? I mean, good, thank goodness there was a freighter in the Atlantic for that one little shorebird, but is there any study that's been done about the different species that fly over water for multiple days and what percentage die?
Yeah, there's probably been a couple of studies on certain species. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with that portion of the literature. Um, but what I think is worth noting is they're not all migrating at the same time. They really do wait until they've got their bodies into the proper condition, before they take off. And that's one of the reasons that we do keep track of things like the fat distribution, for migratory species birds when we're banding them. is because that can tell us a lot about where they're actually at in their migration. It's a pretty steady rate of fat decline, or fat usage rather. So they do try to optimize their chances, but I dare say it's not an insignificant loss. And then that's another thing that climate change has kind of, you know, popped in like a squalling infant and ruined, is things like the unseasonable storms that we get now. If those hit a migration corridor at the wrong time, your best option is you get magnolia warblers in along the Guadalupe River. The the downside of that is probably a lot of birds got, catastrophically injured, or they ended up getting stranded in places where they cannot find food and they cannot find their way back to where they need to be.
Wow, that's really interesting to learn about, that there's so many different factors that go into when they migrate and what
Mhm.
the results are, those overwater birds.